Okay, so as we think about things, how do we get knowledge to stick? We can watch a fun video from Crash Course, and that's always nice. I usually watch that. It's a 10-minute video. Watch it. It's cool. A crash course on memory, study, recognition, recall. Essentially, we can thank Crash Course for helping us understand how the brain works, because when we're dealing with information, when we're dealing with knowledge, we have to realize why we write stuff in the first place. And this is one of the things that I kind of have been geeking out about a little bit more recently, that as we think about the why people write in the first place, rhetorically we could say people write because they want to connect, but scientifically, people write because they're trying to preserve knowledge long term, for future generations. So when we think about writing as a way to store information, to store knowledge, to deal with knowledge, and to train future generations, it has a very noble purpose, and it's really neat that way. And so when we talk about, so that's kind of the anthropological side of writing and its development. Many cultures throughout history were oral tradition cultures. People had to really want to write stuff down, or if they were going to write, partially because of general literacy, but some of it could also be because we don't have all the records for every culture ever. Lots, things like fires in Rome, burning up all the scrolls, stuff like that. Whole other issue. But when we think about why we write in the first place, one of the main reasons we write, that people write, that societies and humanity over time has taken time to carve something out on a stone, to put something in cave paintings. If you think about the movie Croods, it's like, it tells the story and it uses cave paintings to say, here are the rules of life so that we don't die because those people died, right? Thank you, Nicolas Cage, for that one. So as we think about the power of writing and the importance of conveying knowledge, we see why memory is important. We see why being aware of how our brain sort of acts as the first writing technology to encode information or to store information and retrieve information. So that's one of the reasons why watching videos like Crash Course to enhance your memory in the first place is beneficial. And so we want to push into that a little bit. But in that, there are definitely two types of memory that we'll discuss, that I like to discuss in my class. That's recognition memory, recall memory. Recognition memory is when someone says something or does something, or we see something, smell something, hear something, input from somewhere triggers a memory. And sometimes it's someone will say, "What does this word mean?" And you're like, "Oh, what is it? I can't put my finger on it. It's on the tip of my tongue, and it's not just a stick bug like in Lord of the Rings." And then finally someone says, "Oh, the definition of this thing is this," and you're like, "Oh yeah, that's right, that's it." What's the Civil War? Oh, it's right on the tip of my tongue. And they're like, it was in the 1860s in the U.S. Oh, right, yeah. That sort of thing. So there's recognition memory, where a memory is triggered or someone else has to tell you, or you have to look in your notes to get the information. And then there's recall memory, and this is what we use when we actually have the knowledge fully stored, fully retrievable, fully learned in our brains. And so recall memory is, I don't need someone to tell me because I know. And so it's like, I don't need someone to tell me the name of my wife because I know my wife's name. I don't need someone to tell me the name of my 3 daughters. It's not like, hey, what's that lady who are all those women I live with, and what are their names and why are they there? It's like, no, they are part of my everyday life. Yolanda, Leala, Adela, and Mila. Woo! I don't know. It's cool. So point being is that I don't need someone to kind of trigger the memory of those names. However, I might need someone to trigger the memory of which president's which, aside from some of the key ones, because that's not my area of study, and I could be a better public citizen. I'm working on it. So Recognition memory is when we need something to trigger. Recall memory is when we can teach someone the information because the stuff's in our head. So those are important. Watch the video because it talks about things like the Leitner system, the spacing effect, specific strategies on how to hang on to and study information, and especially on memory recall about the importance of making information meaningful. So this is where the scientific and the rhetorical blend, because we can use rhetorical considerations of how do we get a message to be meaningful for us, for our readers, and tie that to the knowledge we want to convey. So when we talked about rhetorical purpose and that sort of thing, or if we haven't yet, when we talk about it, we want to think about the blend of these things. We make a memory meaningful so that it is more memorable, so we can recall information as we need it. And so watch the video, it's cool. So I'm not going to spend too much more time just on memory, but just keep in mind when we're dealing with information, how our brains work is extremely important. It should be noted that most of the time, the memory that's preferred is recall memory. And so the reason for that, you could think about this, but I've already stolen the thunder. So the reason for recall memory is because if you've got it there, it's ready to go. Now, that being said, many people, and many people have made the argument, especially in our day and age, with the abundance of archival technologies, that knowing how to find the information at this stage and with where our society's at, that our ability to find information is actually more important than our ability to have it stored in our brains. And that is a value shift, a significant value shift from many cultures throughout history. Socrates and Plato were, I think it's Socrates. I'm trying to decide which one. I'm trying to remember. But essentially, they were not fans of writing in its in the sense that we would consider it, because some people hold this opinion that when you write something down, sometimes it makes you lazy, or because you don't take the time to memorize. When you write notes down, there's research to say people write notes down and go, oh, I know it, so I don't have to study it. I wrote it down, so I don't have to study it. And so they see that as a problem at the individual level. So in some ways, some people have made the argument that when we're in the moment, we're especially in an oral tradition society, that not writing something down but trying to store it into our brain is extremely important in that culture, because it makes the individual more capable of adapting to situations in the moment. And so there's a value there. There's a cultural value there. That's where we have this sociocultural blend with the scientific. Alternatively, we have the reason people were willing to write things down is because they knew they would die someday, and that knowledge should progress forward. And so there's a blend. And so we have these value systems that change the way we encode information, either into our brains, onto a piece of paper, through a particular technology. And we want to be aware of those perspectives and how they affect the way we try to learn things. So sometimes we'll have this conversation and we'll say, okay, oral tradition or trying to memorize things makes the individual stronger, because they have it ready access, recall memory. Whereas the culture we live in now, where there's heavy emphasis on storing information for retrieval, as a society we have a lot more stored knowledge, but sometimes the individual relies on things like Google or Siri or Wikipedia for that storage, and hope that they can then retrieve that information when they need it, and that their Wi-Fi is not down, or they didn't lose signal, or their phone didn't die, or that their phones are allowed to be used on tests. So we have there's some problems with approaching this, but most of the time, still, having recall memory is extremely important. Knowing how to look stuff up and find meaningful knowledge or sift through knowledge is also important. So maybe I've spent more time than I meant to on this, but watch the other video on techniques for memory. I'm trying to give you the writing scope and the importance and sociocultural values embedded in how we deal with knowledge. So we can think about how we hold on to knowledge. You can go watch the video by Crash Course because it's just cool. Hold on, fail. So one of the big things is that our brain has to believe that knowledge is important. I'm going to keep this video going. No, I'm not. So here's what I'll say. I'm going to scan past these and try and get to this slide. Go back. So if we want our brain to care about things, if we want the knowledge to stick, we have to see it as important. Now, the challenge in many classes is that, especially writing classes, like I'm not ignorant to the fact that most people aren't a fan of writing. I've talked about it in my PTS for writing video. There are a variety of reasons why people don't like writing. Sometimes it's how it's framed. Sometimes it's just that it doesn't seem relevant because we're spending a lot of time studying old dead white guys like Shakespeare or Chaucer or Hemingway or whatever, or Fitzgerald. These dudes. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when we want to make something meaningful, we have to care about it. We have to feel like we're learning something. Now, there is a psychological challenge to this. And so when we think about that, we want to be aware that when we think about recognition and recall, recognition memory can lead us to say, I recognize this, so I must be able to recall this. It's the equivalent of saying, oh, yeah, I got it. Like, I've had a writing class before. I had writing in high school. This is basically going to be the same thing. Yeah, ethos, pathos, logos, got it, moving on. However, recall is much more difficult, as we said, but when we are in, when we talk about this next thing, we're less likely to say, I need to learn this. So I want to talk about the Dunning-Kruger Effect real quick, but essentially the level of importance will determine how our brain deals with knowledge, and so we want to intentionally choose how we want to do that. It's important to note that so to help us anchor this. Sorry, stumbling a little bit. Essentially, as we think about recognition and recall and making information important for our mind to digest and hang on to, there is something that is important, I think around 2000, the Dunning-Kruger Effect. These two scholars came up with this way of thinking about knowledge, and they put two spectrums together in their research to compare the confidence of someone in something, some body of knowledge, and their expertise or knowledge in that field. And kind of what they realized, if you look at the image there, that when someone is first learning how to do something, they are confident. If they know a little bit, they feel like they know a lot. This is like when my 9-year-old says, I want to drive someday, and so then because she's seen me hit the gas or hit the brakes or use the turn signal, she's like, okay, I got it. Steering wheel, stop, go, signal, cool. And she'll call out when other drivers don't do it. But if you've ever driven, there's a lot more to it. And even more than just knowing what to do, it's how to engage in some of the stress of situations that are unexpected. That's part of that maturity thing. I'm not going to diatribe on that. But when we think we know a lot about something, or when we're first getting to know something, because we can't see the whole of what it is, we make the assumption that we understand the whole of what it is. And so it's like, oh, yeah, I got that. It's like, I know this thing, right? And so then there's a point where we are extremely confident, and then we suddenly realize what we don't know, how much we don't know, how big this thing that we're trying to study really is. And so as we do that, the Dunning-Kruger share that we grow less and less confident the bigger this thing gets. The more we understand about something, the less confident we feel in our ability to know it. You don't know what you don't know until you know you need to know it, that kind of thing. So then as we progress through and develop expertise or develop experience or develop knowledge in a particular area, we become more We become more knowledgeable, we become more expert, but that trough, that bottom of that curve, there's actually a phenomenon called the imposter syndrome. And so we know enough to see how big something is, but we don't feel as confident. We don't necessarily trust our own judgment, even when we have meaningful expertise. And then as it hits that up curve again, we get to this place where someone is definitely an expert and knows they're an expert. And if you go past a certain point, your confidence just keeps shooting up, and no one can really argue with you because you know your stuff, but you're still a jerk. That's a whole other thing. Let's not talk about that. That's a whole other thing. That's not scientific necessarily. So, why is this important to recognition and recall? Again, recognition leads us to say, I recognize this, so I got it. I'm able to recall it, of course. I'm fine. It's, oh yeah, I got it. I understand. So because of my confidence level, it's overconfidence. So there's a danger in knowing not enough and being overconfident in that lack of knowledge. There's a danger in knowing some stuff and not acknowledging what you do know. And what we want to do is try and find a balance. And so, as we look at recognition and recall, work on doing recall memory, work on knowing your stuff, or at least having an understanding of how big something can be so you're not overconfident. But what you do know, make sure you know. Remembering, this way you can kind of balance out that principle that when we remember what someone tells us, it's not the same as being able to tell someone else so they can remember. If a teacher says, what are the 3 Greek appeals, and that triggers you to say ethos, pathos, logos, that's not you being able to ask someone what are the 3 Greek appeals completely out of a writing context or rhetoric context or speech context and them knowing or you knowing. So there are principles about how we deal with knowledge and our ability to retain knowledge that is directly linked to our attitude about or our mentality toward or our confidence in what we know or don't know. So I like using 2 verses down here. And there's an ancient proverb that says, do you see a person who's wise in his own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than for him. The idea is that when we are confident or when we think we know, and we don't, there's more hope for a fool, because at least a fool recognizes that they don't know. Secondarily, if anyone thinks he knows anything, he does not yet know it as he ought to know it. And so both of these are meaningful lessons in how much energy we should put into learning something, even if we think we know it, because anything we think we know, we don't know as much as we could know it. There's always more to learn. Okay, with that, I spent a lot of time on recognition and recall, and you still had to watch that video from Crash Course. So I'm going to stop here, and then we're going to dig into other components of the scientific aspect of writing. Enjoy.